When former prisoner Nico Rost came to visit the former Dachau concentration camp in the 1950s, he expressed his utter disbelief at a place where so many persons had suffered so much, but so little had been done to ensure and force remembrance. Indeed, on the contrary, steps seem to have been taken to eradicate most traces of the past. The prisoner barracks had been turned into habitations for German refugees and expellees. A primary school, a post office, and various shops provided for the daily needs of the new inhabitants. The disinfection barracks had been rebuilt into a restaurant. No official memorial paid tribute to those who had suffered and died on the same grounds only a few years earlier. With the exception of the crematorium, which was surrounded by a wall, there was almost nothing that recalled the concentration camp and its horrors. If you look at the pictures, ironically, I don't know if you see that, but ironically you see these little boys who are playing with wooden pistols on the grounds of the former concentration camp. You can still clearly see the watchtowers. Now, Nico Rost's experience mirrored very much the social reality of the 1950s in Germany. In the immediate post-war years, there was as good as no public interest in and around Dachau in the period between 1933 and 1945. This reflected the general wish of the German population to very quickly forget the past and look towards the future. It is therefore not surprising that the very first initiatives to erect an official memorial on the grounds of the former Dachau concentration camp did not come from civil society. They were ordered by the Allied military government that was in charge of Dachau. The fact that the very first instructions for a memorial were forcefully given from above and did not grow out of the wish by citizens to create a place of remembrance, which is often the case with memorials, and we have seen quite a number of examples in the last 2 days. This is maybe one of the reasons, though, that in Dachau there was a number of failures when it came to this. Throughout its history, the transformation of the camp from a historic place of suffering to an official site of remembrance has been characterized by the interplay of different mechanisms of political and social contestation of memory. Having been a transit and concentration camp for mainly political prisoners and boasting a still very active committee of former detainees, Dachau has always constituted one of the focal points for political struggles and social conflict in the present. I've worked there for several years and I can tell you that's still the case, actually. What I will do now in the next 20 minutes or so is trace the mechanism of political and social contestation of memory over time. The discussions surrounding the setup of an international memorial site, so I'm not talking about the memorial site, but of a memorial within the memorial site, on the premises of the former Dachau concentration camp, is only one example of how public remembrance, questions of identity, and political power struggles are interlinked when it comes to the public elaboration of past crimes. And I think many of the elements can be found in some of the other camps that we have discussed in the last 2 days. I was struck by the many parallels that we could see between Fossoli, Drancy, and many of the others that we have discussed in the last 2 days. Now, the history of the International Memorial started shortly after Dachau's liberation on the 29th of April 1945. A provisional memorial, it was a wooden altar with a tall wooden cross, and that struck me that someone said earlier that in Fossoli one of the important memorials in the camp is the little church. So it's interesting that here the very first memorial was also a religious memorial. It was erected by Catholic Polish survivors on the Roll Call Square of the concentration camp on May the 3rd, so just a few days after the camp was liberated. In June 1945, orders to erect a more permanent memorial were given by the Allied military government. Subsequently, an open competition was conducted between April and September 1946. 21 designs were submitted, but none of them received support. Until 1949, the idea of an official memorial disappeared. Local authorities and civilians had clearly no interest in creating an official place of remembrance for events that they had willingly or unwillingly supported. And here maybe I would like to make a parenthesis of saying that Dachau was a concentration camp, but it was very much close to the city, right? So this was not a hidden camp. People knew about it. The prisoners were forcefully driven through the city. So in a way, similar to what we said about transit camps that are always within the local context. But the local authorities having failed to come up with a satisfactory solution, a new initiatives were started only in 1955 by former prisoners who in the meantime had organized themselves in the Comité International de Dachau. And we can say that it was maybe not the failure of the local authorities in the previous years, but also because of new windows of opportunities that had opened up, that allowed concentration camp survivors to move out of the marginalization that German society had confined them to right after the war. There was renewed media attention, for example, to Nazi crimes and the changed political situation. Of course, Germany had entered NATO in 1954. The Cold War tensions had eased after Stalin's death. There was also a wave of anti-Semitic vandalism that had swept across West Germany. And then we had the different Nazi trials that had started in Germany and Italy. And I think all of these elements contributed to an atmosphere of greater openness towards the requests of victims. Then was the publication of the paperback version of Anne Frank's diary in 1955 and the screening of the documentary Nuit et Brouillard when public attention shifted for the first time to concentration camps as places of violence and suffering. As a result, also the grounds of where prisoners had spent most of their time moved into the focus of attention as focal points for commemoration rituals that until then had really taken most of the time place on local cemeteries and crematoriums. The Comité International de Dachau held its constitutive assembly in November 1955 in Brussels. And during this meeting, former prisoners formulated a number of objectives in order to secure the creation of a worthy place of remembrance at the former concentration camp. They said that all relics from the time of the camp, but also everything attributed to the period after 1945, were supposed to be removed. And that's paradoxical if you think that the CED followed almost the same trajectory that did the Bavarian authorities, who after 1945 had shown no interest in preserving what was still left of the camp. When we say that, we obviously have to keep in mind that after the former concentration camp had been liberated, it had turned first into an internment camp run by the American military administration between 1945 and 1948, and then into a refugee camp for Eastern German expellees between 1949 and 1965. As a result, the camp had completely transformed and very little had recalled its history, and therefore the witness account I introduced the talk with, this is exactly coming from this time. There was very little that reminded people of what had happened in the camp. Ideas on how the future memorial should look like and what kind of message it was supposed to transmit varied considerably among its supporters. While the German survivors wanted their solidarity, resistance, and heroism in the struggle against Nazism to be represented, we have to keep in mind this was a camp for political prisoners mainly. There was not that many Jews in there. Survivors of other nationalities were more in favor of illustrating the brutal horrors of the camp. And these internal differences might explain why the CED initially invited only artists to submit a proposal who had been interned in Dachau. It was somehow assumed that the common experiences of suffering would feed into a project that could be shared and accepted by all. The response to this very first call was very limited. There was exactly one proposal from a French and one from a Belgian artist. And this prompted the CED to open the call to other artists from other countries as well. Now, until May 1959, 72 artists from 18 different countries asked for the application forms, 46 then sent in their proposals. None of the proposals, however, received unanimous support by the jury members. The fact that the Bavarian government was not hastening the evacuation of the refugee settlement, the last residents actually only left in April 1965, so that's quite some time after the liberation of the concentration camp. there was missing financial support and insecurity about the future layout of the camp, which further complicated the decision-making process. Only in 1965, another round limited to 4 of the shortlisted candidates of the previous election was called. After lengthy discussions, Nadoglit, a Yugoslav sculptor who had been persecuted by the Nazi as a Jew and had joined the resistance in 1944, won the prize. Now, the different elements that make up the final layout of the memorial try to satisfy these very divergent internal requests that I just described. The bronze sculpture and the jagged path symbolized death and destruction, violence and victimhood. The 2 walls with the inscription and the altar dedicated to the unknown prisoner represent martyrdom, but also hope and a clear message for the future. It says never again, as you can see in different languages. Now on the other side, you have an installation with the change and the patches that make reference to the utopian quality of international camp solidarity in times of distress. And it is almost ironic that particularly this very last element is anything but inclusive if it comes to the representation of the different victim groups. And so let's have a closer look. The rings forming the chain with the colorful triangles symbolize solidarity among the prisoners that made survival possible. That this is an embellished vision of the day-to-day experiences in the camp becomes evident when looking at the eyewitness accounts. The prisoners of the Dachau concentration camp were not a homogeneous group and very quickly developed an internal hierarchy reproducing the categories that were artificially set by the SS during the Third Reich. Prisoners marked with a black, asocials, a green for professional criminals, or with pink for homosexuals patch, were subject to hostility from the outside, while the political prisoners who had a red triangle occupied the highest position within the hierarchy and were treated better. Also nationality played a role. Italians, after 1943 of course, and Russians had a much lower status in the prisoner society than French or Germans. Solidarity and the development of a sense of identity as a community were thus effectively prevented. What is surprising is that the stigmatization connected to this categorization continued even after the war has ended. The patch color determined whether survivors were entitled to compensation. Those stigmatized with a black, green, or pink patch were ruled to have no valid claims for compensation of either a moral or financial kind. This had an immediate effect on the setup of the International Memorial, where prejudices concerning certain victim groups got directly translated into the exclusion of their representation within the memorial. When comparing the colors of the triangles on the oval change to the list of identifiers that had been used in the Dachau concentration camp, which I just showed you in the picture, it becomes immediately evident that 3 patches are missing. So if you look closely, you can see that there's 3 colors missing. There's no green, there's no pink, and there's no black triangle. So excluding the so-called Berufsverbrecher, professional criminals, the so-called Asoziale, asocials, and the homosexuals from the monument. The exclusive focus on certain victim groups and the international exclusion of others clearly reflect the prevailing power balances within the prisoners' community on the one hand and wider society on the other. The CED represented mainly the political prisoners and decided to include only those patches in the final monument whose wearers were recognized as persecuted victim groups in 1945. The rights of the other victim groups were simply ignored. This is partly due to the fact that not all victim groups had a lobby at the time of the erection of the memorial and probably would have refused to be labeled as asocial or criminal after 1945. Homosexuality was on top of that still a criminal offense until 1969. That the same mechanism of exclusion, silencing, and marginalization re-emerged within a group that had been subject to persecution and segregation for years is rather astonishing. It sadly proves how profound and long-lasting the effects of the Nazi ideology were on both victims and perpetrators. Those struggles of interpretation did not stop after the memorial was finally dedicated. The unveiling ceremony took place on the 8th of September 1968 and was accompanied by heavy protests. One factor leading to this incident was the invitation of military bands. While for most former prisoners, the presence of the army was a normal element in a ritual honoring their country's dead, for others, the fact that only bands from Western European countries had been invited caused ambivalent feelings and led to the suspicion that this was, more than anything else, a NATO display. It would take several years before the impact of those described social and political contradictions would diminish and peaceful celebrations could take place that were less characterized by discussions about the right interpretation of past and present events. But did they disappear? I actually don't want to say anything about it. I just put up these pictures and I leave it up to you to decide if they have disappeared, because you will probably see some elements that might have caused some discussion. This is the 70th anniversary of the liberation. To conclude, I can say that the intertwining of different, often political interests on the one hand, and the symbolic meaning of a memorial that is supposed to put aside ideological and political differences and instead focuses on the sacrifices made by the victims on the other, created fertile ground for the public contestation of old subjectivities and hegemonic roles. In Dachau, more than anywhere else, the discussion about the setup of a memorial turned into a struggle about the power of definition. During the planning phase, but also once the memorial was built, it proved to be almost impossible for the survivors to converge on one idea on how to represent the experience of the camp and the lessons for the future. The Dachau case, in this respect, is a very good example, I think, of a situation where a memorial reveals more about the group that it created than about the history it purports to represent. Thank you very much.